My sister stole my wedding dress to wear at her own wedding, but karma hit when she discovered our grandmother cursed it. I, 28F, never believed in curses or supernatural stuff, but what happened at my sister's wedding made me question everything I thought I knew. Let me start from the beginning, and you can judge for yourself if our grandmother's last words were just a coincidence or something more. 2 months ago, I discovered my wedding dress was missing from the preserved box in my closet. At first, I thought I was going crazy. That dress wasn't just any dress. It was my grandmother's, worn by 3 generations of women in our family. The last time I saw it was when I was cleaning out my closet before moving to a bigger apartment with my husband. The dress disappeared right after my sister announced her engagement. She'd been acting weird, avoiding my calls and making excuses not to meet. I didn't think much of it until I saw her wedding invitation with a photo of her in my dress. The same vintage lace, the same pearl buttons down the back, the same slight yellowing on the hem that I'd decided not to restore to preserve its history. I confronted her immediately. The fight that followed was explosive. She screamed that I was being selfish, that I'd already had my wedding, and that grandmother would have wanted her to wear it too. What she didn't know was that grandmother had specific instructions about that dress. The night before she passed, grandmother called me to her bedside. Her words still echo in my head. The dress must be given freely, never taken. Those who take what isn't theirs will carry the weight of their choices. I thought it was just her medication talking, but she gripped my hand with surprising strength and made me promise to remember. I tried warning my sister, but she laughed it off. "You're just trying to guilt-trip me," she said. "It's not like anything bad will happen." The weeks leading up to her wedding were tense. Our parents tried to mediate, but they only made things worse by taking her side, saying I was being dramatic about an old dress. The wedding day started normally enough. The venue was beautiful, the weather perfect, almost too perfect. But during the ceremony, things began to change. As my sister walked down the aisle, wearing our grandmother's stolen dress, the temperature dropped suddenly. People started shivering, despite it being a warm summer day. Then came the photos. Every single picture taken of her in the dress came out distorted. The photographer was baffled, checking his equipment repeatedly. In each photo, the dress appeared darker, almost black, while everything else remained normal. My sister started to panic, but insisted on continuing with the reception. That's when things got really strange. The pearls on the dress began falling off one by one, rolling across the floor like they were being pulled by invisible strings. My sister's new mother-in-law picked one up and yelped. It was ice cold. The wedding cake collapsed without anyone touching it, and when my sister tried to give her speech, her voice completely disappeared. But the worst was yet to come. As she had her first dance with her new husband, the dress began to change color before everyone's eyes, darkening from white to gray to an inky black. People gasped and started recording with their phones, but none of the videos would save. My sister ran to the bathroom in tears, and when she emerged from the bathroom, her face was ghostly pale. The dress had somehow shrunk, tightening around her until she could barely breathe. She tried to take it off, but the zipper wouldn't budge. The more she struggled, the tighter it seemed to get. My brother-in-law tried to help, but the dress was like a second skin, refusing to let go. The wedding planner suggested cutting her out of it, but every time scissors came near the fabric, they went dull. 3 pairs of scissors later, my sister was having a full-blown panic attack. She kept mumbling, "I'm sorry," over and over, though I couldn't tell if she was talking to me, grandmother, or the dress itself. I felt torn between sympathy for my sister and a strange sense of validation. Part of me wanted to help her, but another part remembered how she'd dismissed my warnings, how she'd taken something precious without asking. The guests were starting to leave, whispering among themselves about how they'd never seen anything like it. That night, my sister couldn't sleep. She called me at 3 a.m., crying hysterically. The dress was showing her things, she said, memories that weren't hers. She described our grandmother's wedding day in perfect detail, down to the smell of the gardenias and the way the light hit the stained glass windows. She knew things she couldn't possibly know, like how grandmother had secretly stitched a love note into the hem, or how she'd darned a small tear with thread from her mother's wedding veil. I drove to her house and found her curled up in the corner of her bedroom, still wearing the dress. Her new husband was keeping his distance, clearly freaked out. When she saw me, she grabbed my hands. They were ice cold. "I keep seeing her," my sister whispered. "Grandmother. She's so disappointed. The dress, it's not just fabric. It's memories, it's love, it's everything they felt while wearing it. And I took it. I stole their memories. What happened next still gives me chills." As my sister spoke those words, admitting what she'd done, the dress began to loosen. The zipper that had been stuck for hours suddenly came undone on its own. The fabric, which had been almost alive in its resistance, went limp. When we finally got it off her, the dress looked exactly as it had when I'd worn it, pristine, white, and beautiful. But my sister wasn't the same. The experience had changed her deeply. She spent the next week in bed, barely eating or speaking. When she finally emerged, she handed me a letter. Inside was a confession and an apology that made me cry. She wrote about how jealousy had eaten at her since my wedding, how she'd convinced herself she deserved the dress more than me because she was the youngest, grandmother's special girl. The most shocking part was learning that she'd been planning to sell the dress after her wedding. She'd found a vintage collector willing to pay a small fortune for it. That's why she'd taken it, not out of sentiment but for money. Reading that felt like a punch to the gut. Our grandmother's dress, her legacy, nearly lost because of greed. The house felt emptier than it ever had before. I had spent the past few weeks trying to figure out what went wrong, drowning in a sea of self-doubt and regret. Every corner of the place was a reminder of what used to be. What we used to be. But now, all that was left were ghosts of the past, scattered in the pictures, the furniture, and the small details that felt so big when you lost them. It took a few days for me to gather the courage to pick up the phone and make the call. I had to do it. Even though it felt like the worst thing, even though I already knew the answer, I needed to hear it from him. Maybe I could finally get the full story, the truth. I dialed his number. When he answered, I hesitated for a moment, the weight of what I was about to ask making my throat tighten. But I pushed through it. I just need to understand. Please. I don't even know if you're doing this out of spite or if something else is going on. I need to know what happened. I need to know why you're doing this. There was a long pause before he spoke. I don't think there's anything left to say. It's over. It wasn't what I wanted to hear, but I couldn't stop myself. Was it really the joke? Was that the breaking point? Or was there something else? His voice softened just slightly, and I could almost feel him weighing his words, like he was deciding how much to give away. It wasn't just the joke, all right? That just made it clearer. The way you talked about him, like he was somehow better than me. It made me feel like I wasn't enough. And that's something I can't ignore. I felt a pit in my stomach. I had thought that he was angry, maybe hurt in the moment. But now, hearing him say it out loud, it was like a slap in the face. He wasn't just hurt. He was resentful. He had been carrying that resentment for longer than I realized. I didn't mean it like that, I whispered, trying to make him understand. It was a dumb thing to say. I didn't even think. You know I love you, right? I used to believe that, he replied, his tone flat again. But love doesn't just disappear overnight. You were never really here, even when you were. I felt it. I felt it for months, maybe longer. And now, after all of this, I'm finally letting go. The finality in his voice hit harder than anything else. There was no room for negotiation. No room for discussion. He had checked out long before that night, long before the joke ever happened. It wasn't just about one comment. It was about everything that led up to it. I felt my hands shake as I held the phone, realizing that I was hearing the last pieces of a relationship that had been falling apart for a long time. I don't know what happened to us, I said, my voice breaking. I never saw it coming. It wasn't supposed to be like this. We were supposed to grow old together. There was silence on the other end for a long time before he finally spoke again. I know, but sometimes things just don't work out. We change. We outgrow each other. It hit me like a ton of bricks. We had outgrown each other. We had been so focused on the routine, on keeping things together, that we had never really looked at what was happening between us. We hadn't really talked in months, and now, the words I was hearing from him confirmed everything I had ignored. The lack of intimacy, the unspoken tension, the emotional distance, none of it was new. It had been building for so long that I hadn't even noticed how far we had drifted. I'll sign the papers, I said, my voice a whisper now. It wasn't a question. It was just something I had to do. I couldn't drag this out any longer. I didn't want to. Goodbye, he said, his voice distant, as if we were already strangers. And that was it. That was the last conversation we ever had. In the weeks that followed, I went through the motions. I met with lawyers, signed the papers, and started packing up what was left of him in the house. Things I thought I'd never have to sort through. His clothes, his books, his half-empty drawers. Each item felt like another piece of me being taken away. I spent a lot of time sitting in silence, just thinking. It was hard to let go of the life I thought we had, the life I had planned. It felt like a failure, like I had lost something I couldn't get back. But at the same time, a strange sense of relief started to settle in. There was a certain weight that lifted when the truth became undeniable. We were done. It was over. I didn't blame him. I didn't even blame myself. Things just fell apart, like they sometimes do. The hardest part wasn't the end, though. It was realizing how little we had really communicated in the first place. We hadn't been happy for a long time. But neither of us had the courage to admit it. I remember one of the last nights I spent in the house, just sitting on the couch in the dim light, looking at the empty space around me. It was strange how quiet everything was now, how still. I used to think that the silence was comforting. But now it felt like a reminder of everything I had lost. And then one day I woke up and realized that life goes on. I didn't know what would come next, but I knew that I couldn't keep holding on to the past. I had to let go, even if it hurt. I had to rebuild. So I took a deep breath and took that first step into the unknown. And somehow it was the hardest, yet the most freeing thing I had ever done.